I'm sorry. Look in the maid's closet. H. For a man used to solving problems by signing checks and making late-night phone calls, this was a riddle no bank account could fix. For a man whose wife had died 9 months earlier in a hospital that smelled of disinfectant and regret, this was something else entirely, an abandonment not of possessions, but of a person who had, against all expectations, become a presence in their small, private world. Gabriel stood very still. The apartment was too big when only 2 of them inhabited it. Portraits of Mariana smiled from frames with the kind of melancholy that keeps grief company rather than chasing it away. The crib in the corner had a neat mobile that slowly spun with stars. A mug sat on the kitchen counter with lipstick at the rim, a fragment of a life that continued to feel sudden and accidental. He thumbed the paper again and watched Davy reach for the edge of a blanket, fists working at the fabric like he had always done, not knowing the exact weight his small hands carried into Gabriel's already fragile day. The note smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. The handwriting tilted, careful, not like a flight of panic, but the trace of someone trying to be deliberate under pressure. Helena had not been a mere employee here. She'd become a quiet architecture of their days. She had sung when Davy fussed, prepared oatmeal in a bowl Gabriel never learned to eat, and kept the small rituals that stitched together morning from night. She had been the one who, on certain evenings when Gabriel came home to a house that lectured his loneliness with echoing rooms, would put a soft hand on his shoulder and say, with an economy of words he could not manage, "He's sleeping. We'll be here." But she had also had a past that she had not unfolded to him, a past that would, once revealed, make his resources and his name an awkward tool in a world he had never wanted to enter, the world of debts, threats, and desperate people who reach for any hand that might help them buy a few more months, a few more days. He set Davy on the floor, the child's bare feet slapping softly against the rug. The apartment smelled faintly of lemon and baby soap. It smelled of normalcy that could be rubbed off with the smallest addition of disruption. Gabriel carried the paper across the hall and opened the service door that led to the staff quarters. It was a smaller world within his home, a narrow corridor, a shelf with the community toaster, and an old calendar. The maid's closet was at the end, a plain door with a brass knob that had been polished by hands which had never been his. When he opened it, sunlight struck a box tucked toward the back, behind coats that smelled faintly of lavender and old rain. Inside the box were things that belonged to both lives: a folded baby blanket with a faded elephant, a pair of tiny clothes with slight stains that told stories of midnight feedings, a Polaroid with a baby whose face was blotted by time, but whose eyes, sharp, haunted, stared back with an honesty no one could fake. Beneath the photograph lay a certificate folded in 2. The page was creased, the ink had the slant of officialdom. Gabriel's fingers trembled before he refolded it, reading the name and date with a precision that felt like an incision. Miguel. Born the same day as Davy. Died the same day, the certificate said, though it did not speak of the manner. Death, in those sterile fonts, felt too blunt a word for what a mother carries. There was also a small leather-bound book. Gabriel hesitated, then opened it. The handwriting inside was different from the shorthand on the note, rounder, sometimes sloping into a loop that suggested it was written in the late hours, by candlelight or a lamp kept low to avoid waking a sleeping child. He read the first excerpt aloud to himself without meaning to, the words becoming anchors in a sea of questions. Helena. Journal entry. March 12th. I keep seeing him in Davy's hands. It's a mercy and a cruelty. I wake wanting to undo the day I couldn't hold him. I cannot say his name in front of the neighbors. They would not understand that loving another little person does not steal my grief. The voice on the page was raw, but not theatrical. It was the voice of someone who had learned to measure their grief in small increments. An hour of getting out of bed, a day without saying his name, the hours of repetition that make a life survivable. Gabriel sat back against the closet wall. The apartment hummed around him. On the tape, as he had once known it, this should have been a problem to be solved quickly. Who took the nanny? Where had she gone? Was a crime at play? He called Clarice, his secretary, before he even knew why. Clarice's voice was immediate, exacting, and practical. She had been the bridge between his grief and the world, doing for him what he could not in those early months, returning calls, arranging meetings, being the face of inertia when he was negotiating with absence. "She took an advance last week," Clarice said on the phone. 3 months of salary. She told me it was for medical bills. I approved it because she looked exhausted, Gabby. I didn't know she was leaving." "You didn't know she was leaving," he repeated, tasting the sentence like something made of glass. "She asked for a day off yesterday," Clarice continued. "Said she had to go to the registry to finish some papers. She left the note for you. Antonio saw her leave the building around 5. We have the delivery logs, nothing else." Antonio was the doorman, a man who took small, unglamorous pride in the order of the building. He had been here long enough to know the patterns of all the staff. When Gabriel walked into the lobby, he found him leaning on the reception counter, hands calloused and resting as if on a ledger. "She left with a small bag," Antonio said. "Cab stopped in front. A man in the cab. She spoke to him for a minute and then got in. That was the day before yesterday." "Did he look like someone she knew?" Gabriel asked. "She talked quickly," Antonio said. "I didn't see faces. They were quick like people who don't want to be noticed." Gabriel's head filled with scenarios. One involved a woman stepping into a taxi and starting a new life. Another, darker, had more corners, men with eyes like clocks waiting for payment, a levy that can't be delayed. He felt the tug of his own resources. His money could buy information, surveillance, lawyers, all the things that mattered in a world where decisions were made for price. But money could not recollect why someone loved his son in the particular way Helena had loved him. Money could not mend what had been wounded in the past. He asked Clarice to pull the building's CCTV footage. He called Alberto, his lawyer, and said, "Look into any loans under the name Helena Rodriguez. See what you can get. Official channels first, and make a discreet inquiry with Detective Paulo." "I don't want noise, Clarice. I want results." The camera in the staff quarters had a grainy quality when he watched the footage. The timestamp flickered, and the image did not have the clarity of television dramas. Helena appeared as she always did in living things recorded, ordinary and therefore easy to overlook. She pulled a small bag through the corridor, kissed Davi on the head as if to transfer some small blessing, and walked out into the street. A cab drew up. A man stepped out and spoke to her. She hesitated for a breath, then climbed inside. Then the image cut. The discovery of the box and the diary did not resolve anything. It deepened everything. It made Gabriel ask questions he had not allowed himself to ask when grief was new. What blurred line allowed someone to call his child mine in the private geometry only a caregiver and a baby can inhabit? How had Helena's love crossed boundaries that were both tender and perhaps dangerous? There were other things in the box that were less legible than the certificate. Photos of a hospital room strewn with a small blue hat, a receipt from a clinic, a folded hospital bracelet with a name on a thin sticker that time had almost scrubbed away. Each artifact was a filament tying Helena to a story of loss and desperation. It explained without excusing the tremor in her voice when she would look at Davy and smile with a softness that sometimes bordered on sorrow. He read another journal entry, the letters leaning into themselves as if the writer had been speaking into a pillow. Helena, journal entry, March 29th. They tell me that time makes things less sharp. It blunts. No one told me time would also make me more dangerous, gentler and more reckless in the same breath. When I hold him, I feel his little ribs breathe, and for a while I can pretend that the world is not the shape it has become. Words like dangerous and reckless changed tone into texture. Gabriel felt wary of the way Helena's writing laced tenderness with a subtext of necessity. The diary did not say, "I will hurt to have what you have." It said things more complicated. "I've been hurt, so I will cling." There were practical notes, too, amounts scribbled in the margins, numbers that looked like they could be debts, names of places he did not recognize. A line near the back read, "Rodrigo called. He set something up. He says it's the only way." Gabriel underlined the name with his finger. Rodrigo Almeida. He had heard the name mentioned once by Clarice when she had been trying to arrange Helena's advance. Rodrigo, a man who appeared in the peripheries of small, fraught economies, a pusher of short-term loans and long-term demands. Gabriel imagined a bruised landscape where Rodrigo's business made people owe their sleep to someone else's calendar. He did not like the ways wealth simplified things on paper and complicated them in the gut. On paper, he could hire a private investigator, he could wire money to whoever had demands, he could make calls that would send police to the right addresses. In the gut, none of that paid for the tender life in his arms. A day later, footage from the street cameras clarified a different picture. The taxi had not turned a corner and disappeared. The timestamp on the video dropped them into a bus station, a place of departures and arrivals that carried the smell of diesel and old shawls. The grainy footage caught Helena getting off the cab and talking with a man whose face was more visible this time. A profile that had an edge, too short hair, a jacket with a logo. She gave something to him. It looked like cash. Then a cluster of men appeared, part of the movement that comes with debt collectors or enforcers. They spoke to Helena. She seemed to say no. They did not listen. The building's concierge had told the truth when he said she left with a small bag. The footage showed her stepping away from the camera's eye and into a van parked just outside the terminal. It was abrupt. There was no dramatic struggle, no theatrical scene to play out on a screen. It was an efficient, practiced interception. Gabriel watched this footage in a conference room with Alberto and Clarice. The lawyer's face was efficient in ways that did not always comfort. Alberto's first instinct was to parse outcomes, legal pathways, cooperation with police, leveraging any surveillance in the city. Clarice considered the human pieces, the blanks where their knowledge failed. When Gabriel asked, "Where does Rodrigo fit into this?" both men looked at him with the kind of politeness reserved for people who keep their soft edges hidden for meetings. "We find Rodrigo," Alberto said. "We talk to him. We see what he knows. If there are criminal elements, we involve the police. But we have to be careful. If Helena is being held, a media circus could make negotiations harder." Gabriel nodded. He had watched televised kidnappings once, marveling at the way cameras turned fear into performance. He did not want that. He wanted his nanny back. He wanted the woman who had hummed lullabies to his sleeping son back. He wanted the things that seemed simple and ordinary. Someone to prepare a bottle at 3 a.m., someone who knew the exact angle Davy's thumb should take to find his ear. Killing this with publicity would break the fragile trust of a private life exposed. "Can you get me Rodrigo's address?" he asked. "Discreetly." Alberto's jaw tightened. "We can get his last known contacts. But Gabriel, we have to move through channels that respect the law. We can't—" "I know," Gabriel interrupted. "I don't want a headline. I want her home." Clarice drew a breath. "Antonio remembers a man who used to come into the building, someone who looks like you describe. He said the man always left in a hurry, sometimes with envelopes." "That's him," Gabriel said. The moment of recognition was flat and firm, like a stone dropped into a pool. Ripples followed. They worked for days in that compartmentalized way wealth allows: lists, phone calls, appointments. Gabriel walked the city in the evenings when it felt less like a place of deals and more like a place of people. He found, to his subdued surprise, that seeing the streets was a kind of medicine. Mariana had loved walking, and their apartment windows in the evenings used to frame her presence like a lighthouse. Now the streets framed a different kind of navigation. He met with Detective Paulo, who bore the polite abrasions of a man who had watched too many human tragedies and preferred to keep distance. Paulo's color was practical. He had little patience for theatrics and a good eye for where cold facts lay. "You have something we can work with," Paulo said. "Footage, receipts, witnesses. We can prioritize, but we need cooperation. You understand that if there are unpaid debts and people with the means to track her, it becomes riskier the longer she is gone." Gabriel answered as he always did when the world required the currency of both money and moral posture. "I will do whatever is necessary, Detective, but do it with discretion. We want Helena back. We want her safe." There was a pause where both men acknowledged the same thing, that Helena's safety was no longer an abstraction but a lever on which people's lives would change. While the legal route bent itself into shape, Gabriel did the thing his grief taught him to be cautious about. He went into Mariana's side of the apartment. There were 2 chairs by the window where she used to read, and a blanket that still smelled faintly of her perfume, a soft musk that made the hole inside his ribs hurt in a new way. He took out the box of things he had kept with a stubborn, almost superstitious faith. Children's drawings, a pressed hospital bracelet with Mariana's handwriting, notes they had written to one another in the margins of a cookbook. He tried to let the past teach him how to act now. It taught him that love could be cunning and fragile both. That evening he found himself sitting on the nursery floor with Davy asleep against his chest. The baby's breath was soft. The journal's pages, left open on the table, seemed to glow under the reading lamp. He read another entry aloud as if letting the words into the air would make them truer. Helena, journal entry, April 3rd. I promised him I would be better. I promised I would not take what I cannot give. But there are nights when the air is so thin and I think I cannot breathe without the weight of what's owed. If someone offered me breath, would I take it? Would you forgive me, if you were me? The question hovered, impossible to answer from the outside. It could not be met with a checkbook or a phone call. It demanded something else, an understanding of how despair and devotion can braid themselves into a single rope. Gabriel spent the next day with a different vigilance. He wanted the mechanics of the disappearance and demanded them like an engineer building a bridge. Cab logs, CCTV footage, phone records. He wanted to understand the world Helena had been moving in. He wanted to see its edges. Clarice delivered phone traces that showed a string of calls over 3 months to a number registered to a small outfit on the city's outskirts. It was the sort of number that might belong to a hardware store, but in the margins of those invoices was a different truth. A pattern of transfers, small sums, and then larger withdrawals that corresponded to the dates on the slips in Helena's journal. Rodrigo's name showed up not only in the diary, but in the ledger of a few small eateries and a repair shop. Gabriel followed the trail as if it were one of his companies, careful, methodical, with an eye for the pattern that money left when it moved. When he confronted Rodrigo's last known address with a discreet security team, they found an apartment that had been vacated in a hurry. Paint was still wet in places, dishes unwashed. A neighbor, a woman who sold fruit from a cart, remembered a man who had spoken in a voice that was used to being obeyed. She would not go on the record, but she told Gabriel that Rodrigo had argued loudly on the phone about payments and people who expected the debt to be covered. Gabriel started to put together a map. It was not a romantic map of heroes and villains. It was a ledger of need, a series of appointments and small violences. People owed money. Rodrigo collected. Helena spun between those axes like a moth circling flame, her love for Davy blurring into the currencies that might keep her from being suffocated by obligation. The day the van footage appeared, with Helena stepping off the cab and into the van, Gabriel felt the stirrings of things he had not felt since Mariana's funeral, an anger so cold it zipped down to his bones. How dare they? How dare anyone take a person who had been a refuge for his son? How dare people presume that money solves every problem without considering the moral risk of buying safety rather than building it? He did not want to be the kind of man whose first reflex was to throw cash like a bandage over a wound. He wanted to be decent, but decency was not a singular action. It was a sequence of them. He owed it to his son to be present. He owed it to Helena, if she was being held, to negotiate not only her release but a way back that did not feed shame. Detective Paolo was precise. If there is a group behind this, he said, they will take money. They will test to see if you're serious. They will demand proof of willingness to pay. They will also test what happens when you call the police. They are not stupid. Then we let them think I'm paying, Gabriel said quietly, but we do it with people in the room. We create a path. Paolo gave him a look that mixed pragmatism with a kind of unofficial permission. You cannot act alone. We will have officers on standby, but this is delicate. If the people holding her think she's useful to them, they will hold her. If they think she's a liability, they might let her go. But in my experience, the only safe way to move is with the law at your shoulder. Gabriel agreed. He spent nights drafting the kind of plan he had once made for elusive corporate acquisitions. Points of contact, limits, thresholds. He was surprised at how his brain, which had long trained itself to spreadsheets and projections, became a tool for something more vulnerable, getting a person home. Alongside this, another story unfurled at the edges of his attention. He discovered small kindnesses Helena had woven into their daily life, a folded note under Davy's pillow with a tic-tac-toe game drawn in ballpoint pen, a line of tiny drawings at the back of the nursery closet where she had sketched an elephant in the margin of a grocery list, a practice that seemed to chase away the more brutal handwriting on the debts in her journal. These tokens made it harder to see her as only a problem to be solved. They made him think of her as a human being who had been both wounded and generous. There were other complexities. Rodrigo, when he eventually consented to a meeting under the pressure of quiet threats and private checks, spoke in the kind of voice that has been hardened by necessity. He knew streets, Gabriel did not. He told stories that were not wholly true but contained enough fact to make them believable. He admitted that people he worked with had been pressuring him. He said there had been talk of taking someone to make an example. He blinked, and for a moment Gabriel saw fear behind the bluster. "She vanished," Rodrigo said. "Not my doing, but I have men. I can find men who find things. I can tell you where she was last seen." "You can find her," Gabriel said. Rodrigo shrugged like a man who'd been taught to teach. "For a price?" It was a vulgar calculus, as if life could be reduced to an exchange rate. But things in the world sometimes are. Gabriel did not hurl his rage at Rodrigo. He surprisingly negotiated. He knew the difference between anger and leverage, and in that difference he found a flicker of respect for how desperate people built their own scaffolding for survival. Outside the apparent transactions, there was a quieter, more invasive investigation. Gabriel started sitting more hours in the nursery than he had planned. He learned how Davy tilted his head when he listened to the refrigerator hum. He learned the exact angle at which the child blinked at sunlight. He wanted to preserve these small facts as if they were the borders of a country he feared might be erased. He also wanted to be the kind of father who could say later, "We did everything we could to bring her home." One night, Clarice brought him a copy of a message Helena had left in a small envelope on the kitchen table months before. It was not a letter of promises, but of small instructions. How to warm paprika chicken, where the spare pacifier lived. What to do when Davy's cough sounded like nothing and everything. The envelope contained a photograph of Helena with a baby outside a hospital, the baby wearing a blue hat, a scarf looped around the child's neck. The note read, "If anything ever happens to me, take this as proof that I was here. Tell him I loved him." It felt like a relic found in an archaeological dig for the human heart, love transcribed in pantry notes and pacifier locations. Gabriel folded the paper and kept it with him in meetings where decisions were made. He used it as a map to remind him of the endgame. Not scandal, not punishment, but the safe return of someone who had given his child tenderness. The diary entries multiplied in his mind like braids of memory. He would read them aloud in the car when he drove to Rodrigo's neighborhood or when Detective Paulo fed him updates. He read the entries as if the voice on the page might offer him a path to understand choices that had been both desperate and upright in a strange way. Helena, journal entry, April 7th. I thought if I loved him hard enough, my chest would stop hollowing out. But love is not a plaster. It is an argument. I am tired of losing to silence. Between the diary's lines and Rodrigo's evasions, a new understanding settled into Gabriel that the world of debts and the world of tenderness had collided in a person he had relied upon. It was dissonant and full of humanity. Then the CCTV released another frame that made their pragmatic planning tilt into urgency. It caught a van turning toward the Port District, a place where the city's edges met the river and where freight bays hid bewildered things. The timestamp indicated that the van had moved out of the jurisdiction that Gabriel's private security had traced. Someone, it seemed, was shepherding Helena into a space where her disappearance would be harder to undo. Detective Paulo spoke plainly. If they're moving her further from the city, someone in that group is treating this like freight. People move freight with fewer questions than they move people. Gabriel felt something like a current inside him. It was not merely anger, it was an animal insistence to act. He had been a man who had built companies. He had not built a family the way people who inherit generations of domestic knowledge did. But he had, unexpectedly and irrevocably, built one with Mariana, a small private ecology that Helena had become part of. Now that system was threatened, and his response was not merely to tender checks, but to mobilize in a way that would cost him something more than money. Time, presence, perhaps the arrogance of thinking he could control what people do to others. He asked Paulo, "What do we do now?" Paulo looked at him with the steady look of someone familiar with the choreography of danger. "We go to where the van went. We canvass, we pull license plates, we use the guys who track cargo. But Gabriel, this is not a movie. We need patience and a plan." Gabriel swallowed. He had patience in the clinical sense. He could outlast markets. What he did not have was the kind of patience that allowed fear to sit in his veins unmoved. He moved anyway. He signed the forms that allowed Detective Paulo to work with corporate security teams. He instructed his own people to find the van's GPS markers. He sat up nights with a map spread on the table, red pins marking places he did not want to see. At home, among the ordinary rituals of a child and a broken family, he kept finding reminders of why he had to act with both force and tenderness. A tiny shoe under the couch, the way Davi would laugh when Gabriel made odd faces, a telephone cord the child had chewed like a teething relic. He began leaving himself notes, small instructions to be a father. Practice bedtime song. Call Alberto about Rodrigo. The notes were not as eloquent as the diary's entries, but they served the same purpose of guiding the heart through its labor. The morning the port footage was traced to a warehouse district with a cluster of shipping containers, Gabriel felt the world narrow into precise aim. He was not a man who wanted hero photographs of himself. He wanted a woman who had sung his child to sleep to return and to be able to look at him without the weight of her secret hovering between them. He wanted to see if grief could be softened by honesty, and whether a man who had used money as a blunt instrument could instead use it to rebuild trust. Clarice, faithful and pragmatic, cornered him that afternoon with a cup of coffee and a level voice. "What will you do if we find her and she tells you she left because she wanted to, or that she manipulated things, or that she did something you can't forgive?" Gabriel held the paper with Helena's handwriting in his pocket, the note that had started this. He thought of Davy's small hands and of Mariana's laugh echoing in other rooms. His answer felt simple and complicated at once. "Then we will listen," Gabriel said. "We'll get her help. We'll do right by the law, but I will not leave a person in danger because of what they might have done." It was his first explicit articulation of a moral stance in months, a commitment to action shaped by empathy more than posterity. He had in this early phase of the search been testing his edges, how far he would go to save someone who had been almost family. He had not realized that in saving Helena he would be confronting the architecture of his own avoidance, the way grief had been housed under neat routines so that it would not leak into his days. In the search for a woman who had loved his child, he had made the first tentative step toward a father who could be present. Days blurred into a pattern of small victories, a lead on a van, a phone that lit up with a number traced to a payphone near a freight terminal, a witness who remembered a woman with a soft voice. Each clue tightened the knot of possibility into something approaching certainty. And then, one evening, the security footage raised its head like a slow, uncomfortable truth. It showed Helena getting off the cab at the terminal and being intercepted. The men moved with the efficient calm of people who had rehearsed the choreography of taking what was owed. She did not scream. In the footage, she looked for a second at the camera, and her face, caught in the grainy pixels of technology, showed not a scream, but a small human curl of defiance, or perhaps a plea. Gabriel watched it twice. He did not let himself imagine the worst. He simply felt the narrowing of everything into a single, clear goal, to find her and bring her back. He stood up from the chair where he had watched the footage with Detective Paulo and cleared his throat. There were no big speeches in him now, just a careful inventory of steps. "We go after them," he said. Paulo's response was professional and soft, a map offering the routes out. "We follow the van's trail. We use the contacts who handle cargo. We prepare for negotiation." Gabriel looked at the map and felt the old familiar logic of acquisition growing into something more tender. This was not a takeover target. This was a human being. The tools were similar. Contacts, teams, leverage, but they must be used with a different ethic. He left the conference room with a phone number in his pocket that might be the first trace of a chain of custody. He left also with a loose, unformulated promise to a woman he barely knew and had never heard confess everything, that he would not abandon her in the calculus of debt. When he opened the nursery door, Davy was awake, sitting up with a small plastic ring clutched to his chest. The child looked up at Gabriel and laughed, a short, unfailing vibration that seemed to say, "Be here." Gabriel sat on the floor and let the small weight of the child press into him. For a moment the world was reduced to the rhythm of tiny breaths. Then he rose, more resolved than before, and reached for his phone. He would buy time with his resources, if necessary. He would coordinate with Detective Paulo. He would negotiate with men he despised, all to keep a promise that had been entrusted to him by a woman who had chosen, in small ways, to be part of their life. He did not yet know if the repayment asked of him would be merely financial or require him to cross into darker moral spaces. He would soon learn that the consequence of rescue is rarely clean. But in the immediate, simple hours following the footage, his mind kept returning to one persistent fact. The letter had not been a farewell. It had been a roadmap. He sat at the kitchen table while the city slid into evening and read the journal again, tracing the loops of ink as if they might guide him into understanding. Helena. Journal entry. April 10th. I'm writing to the part of me that remembers light. I will not leave him if I can help it. If I must go to keep him safe, I will go with my shame and my love sewn into my pockets. The words settled into Gabriel like a benediction and a summons. He folded the journal closed and felt, in that moment, a strange kinship with someone he had only known in fragments. The decision to act moved from being a choice to become an obligation, not only to Helena, but to Davi, to Mariana's memory, and to the fragile possibility of building a family that was not only about absence. Outside, the city lights winked on one by one. Inside, the house held its breath. He made his calls. He prepared a single private note to leave on the kitchen table for whoever might come home. A promise that they would be found, and not by spectacle, but by patience, by law, and by the stubborn mercy that sometimes follows grief. It was the beginning of something that was not yet rescue, not yet resolution. It was the start of an unraveling and a remaking. What would you do if your nanny vanished and your child returned with a single crumpled letter? Comment below. Would you pay, call the police, or try to handle it alone? The next days would demand negotiations he had not rehearsed. They would ask of him things that money could not easily answer: forgiveness, the willingness to trust again, and the patience to let professionals do their dangerous work while his heart lurched in the margins. He felt the contours of that danger now, like a map with shaded areas he could not yet cross. He would move toward them anyway, pulling his resources in for a rescue that could not be simple. When the van's last known coordinates threaded into Detective Paulo's list of leads, Gabriel made one final call that night. He remembered the shape of Mariana's laugh and the way she had once said, "We will do what love asks even when it's inconvenient." He had not always lived up to that promise. Now he intended to. He pressed the green button, and the line went through like a promise. At the other end, Rodrigo's voice answered, ragged but precise. "You have money," he said. "Find her," Gabriel replied. Rodrigo made a sound that might have been amusement or the rhythm of someone simply doing an arithmetic in his head. "It won't be simple. Make it possible." There was a pause. It was not an agreement, but it was a thread. Gabriel hung up and felt for the first time in months the pinch of a plan beginning to be stitched to its cloth. He did not know then exactly how the next move would look. The sudden heat of negotiation, the low hum of police radios, the way a warehouse would smell of oil and dust and the city's breath. He only knew that the letter had been a key. He only knew that the baby with his crumpled paper had become the hinge on which everything would turn. He had to follow the hinge to see what kind of door it would open. Gabriel hung up the phone and let the apartment's quiet press against him for a second, the lullaby of household appliances filling the spaces where conversation would have been. He folded the journal and slipped it into the inner drawer where he kept small things he called remnants. The map on the table felt like a battlefield replica, pins and thin red strings connecting a truth he had not wanted to know with remedies he had to enact. Detective Paulo called the next morning with a plan that had been sharpened into something workable. "We'll arrange a drop," he said. "Not a ransom in the classic sense. No one puts this out on TV, no spectacle. We use decoys, controlled payment, undercover officers in civilian clothes, and your team as a legitimate intermediary. Rodrigo will make the contact. He'll have to lead us to a handoff point. We go in tight. We have to assume they'll test you." Gabriel listened and repeated each step aloud, as if saying the plan made it more tangible. "No cameras inside the warehouse. Officers in radio silence until the signal. I'll be ready to step back if it risks her life." Paulo's voice was flat, but there was a quiet that meant he approved. "Bring anyone close you can trust, but keep it small, and be ready for ambiguity. These operations never behave like the rehearsals." They set a time for the rendezvous. Alberto arranged legal buffers, authorizations for limited surveillance, contingency funds, and a formal notification to the district attorney if arrest seemed likely. Clarice coordinated with corporate security to make their participation appear routine, a logistics payment, a pickup of a supply order that would explain a large transfer, and the presence of a delivery vehicle. Rodrigo was to be their intermediary. Gabriel bribed the thought of it away and focused on the leverage Rodrigo had offered, the map he could provide in exchange for a price. When the day came, the city wore a flat metallic sky, the kind of light that washed detail into gray. The port area smelled of diesel and salt, engine heat carrying undercardboard aromas of oil and rust. Shipping containers leaned like monoliths, their painted numbers a language of industry that could swallow people in its vocabulary. Gabriel kept to the back seat of a nondescript van. He had told Clarice to stay in the apartment in case anyone called. She refused, and so came disguised in plain clothes with a face that said, "Steal under worry." Paulo's unit positioned itself along alleys that cut the warehouses into anonymous rooms. 2 unmarked cars idled. An officer thumbed a radio keyed to a channel that hummed with low, professional voices. Alberto stood slightly apart, hands tucked into the pockets of a sport coat that did not pretend to belong here. They waited, counting breaths like tiny metronomes, as if the rhythm of their inhalations would anchor the plan. Rodrigo arrived in a white utility truck, the kind that carried plastic crates and promises of quick fixes. His face was the map of someone who had made risky trades, tight around the jaw, with eyes that measured possibilities as currency. He eased out, his fingers fiddling with a cigarette that he did not, in the end, light. "You got cash?" he asked, because everyone knew the rituals of these exchanges, words that disguised urgency as business. Gabriel nodded. "We have the money, but we need her free. No theatrics." Rodrigo's mouth turned into something like a smirk that did not reach his eyes. "I can get you a man who's been asking for a return. He likes to make people understand the cost." He tapped his temple as if there were a ledger stored there. Rodrigo led them through a gate into a yard of stacked containers. They moved under an arch of metal. A low dog barked somewhere. At the far end, a cluster of men waited beside a van whose back doors gaped like a mouth. They were careful not to look like villains in a film. They wore work clothes, but their manner spoke of choreographed indifference. One of them shuffled toward Rodrigo and exchanged words that Gabriel didn't want to, hear entirely. Then something small happened that broke the plan's brittle calm. Helena appeared at the back of the van. She was pushed from inside by a hand that was more rough towel than human, and she stumbled into the light, hair pulled in an anxious knot, clothes folded into an impression of haste, eyes blackened by sleeplessness. For a second she seemed to see the world with the hollow that a captive learns, shocked, processing a release for which she has not yet learned the language. Gabriel's breath stopped as if it had been held by someone who thought long enough to feel the foreshortening of his life. He was at once a man with power and a man who held a child's life as an axis. The two concepts did not always fit in the same pocket. The leader, the man who had a scar running down his left cheek, stepped forward. He had the air of someone who had made compromises thick enough to make him wise in trouble. "You paying?" he asked, voice flat. Gabriel watched Paulo's signal. The officer motioned, "Patience." The leader wanted to be seen as the boss of a small stage. Rodrigo offered a sealed envelope, and the leader smelled of counting and of fear mingled with satisfaction. He accepted the package and walked to the van. He did not immediately leave. He wanted to hold the moment as long as he could. Helena stood between the men and the van, a thin figure who had been made of fear and tenderness in equal measure. When she saw Gabriel, if she did see him in that first wave of shock, something fragile moved on her face. recognition, and then a look that tried to reconcile the fact that a man who could write money into existence had come here on foot, in the background, to meet grief with action. Someone moved too quickly, either a man who had misjudged the choreography or a muscle spasm in a hand, and the leader flared, calling back to the others. Paolo decided they could not wait for perfect timing. He gave the signal, the kind of sharp, brief movement that cut across hesitation. Officers came out from shadows, stepping from behind crates like ghosts that had been waiting for their cue. For a moment there was a shuffle and a small, harsh exchange. The leader tried to fold back into bravado and used a movement meant to throw off the police. A scuffle followed, quick enough to disorient. Rodrigo swore in a way that was almost comic considering the stakes. A man lunged for the envelope, then retreated when he saw the police faces he had not expected. The officers moved with professional restraint but with force enough to close the space between danger and control. Hands were cuffed. A muffled noise came from the van, a sound that could have been a sob or a grunt. Helena, who had for most of this event been a silhouette of endurance, collapsed into a heap by the van, and someone handed her to an officer who had a soft manner and hollow eyes. She smelled of the place, diesel and dust, but under that, something raw, sweat and the salt of a woman who had been kept too long in worry. Gabriel walked forward, not quite knowing if he could trust movement not to scare her. He lowered himself onto an overturned crate at the edge of the scene and waited while the officers completed their sweep, breathed in the container-laced air, and readied themselves to transport the detainees. Paolo came over, removed his cap with hands that were steady and unshowy. "We got them," he said. "A few arrests, a couple let out on bail because we need a stronger tie to the ringleader, but we have enough to question a line of men, and Rodrigo's information helped. We'll need statements. We'll need you to be ready to say you negotiated a payment for a supply pickup. Call it corporate logistics. It helps the case." Gabriel's legs felt like wood. He stood and approached Helena carefully as if she might shatter. Her face was pale, small tremors running through her hands. She held herself with the coiled instinct of someone who had learned how to survive. When she saw him, her eyes, large, raw, found his. There was gratitude and embarrassment braided together, and a thin thread of fear. He knelt because being the right height for someone means being ready to meet them. He did not reach to embrace her. The action might have been too intimate, too quick. Instead, he offered a hand, and she took it like someone reaching for a rail on a steep stair. Her grip was warm and dry. She did not speak at first. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. Her voice was a crack of adult timbre. "No, she swallowed. "I thought if I left, it would keep him safe. I thought if I left with the shame, they would leave him alone." "You left him a note," he said, and there was no accusation in his voice, only the fact. "You told me to look in the closet." Helena's mouth made a small, wet sound that was almost a laugh and almost not. "I didn't want him to get taken," she said. "I was trying to—" Her throat closed. "I thought you'd hate me if you knew the cost." "You were trying to protect him," Gabriel said, "even if it meant you carried the weight." She looked at him as if studying whether he could hold the truth without breaking it. Then, quiet as thought, she said, "I'm sorry." The policeman took her statement later, in a small room that smelled of disinfectant and paper. She answered in scraps at first, then in longer sentences. She told them of Rodrigo's promises, of debts that had swelled, of men with patience for extracting payments who had zero patience when someone failed to deliver. She spoke of nights when the chest closed and the world reduced to a single problem. Find a way to feed the ache until it passed. Detective Paolo pressed for facts, names, places. Helena, exhausted, remembered enough that the officers had what they needed: locations, partial license plates, the rhythm of men she had seen move money in the city's nooks. The police kept a careful line. They treated her as a witness and as someone who had been coerced. They did not slap labels on her. Paolo knew the stakes: convict the ringleaders, protect the vulnerable, and build a case that didn't collapse under procedural missteps. Rodrigo, when questioned, faltered. Under pressure, he supplied details and made clear he had been more of a middleman than a mastermind. In exchange for substantial cooperation, his attorney whispered of leniency. To the precinct, such trade-offs were familiar and unwelcome in equal measure. Law often folds around bargains that do not satisfy the moral appetite but secure prosecutable outcomes. Paulo took what he could do within the law and knit it into an effective strategy. Helena was taken from the station not to a prison cell, but to a hospital where she could be evaluated, and to a women's shelter coordinated with social services. She moved through institutional care with a puzzlement that was the geography of someone who had been kept small by fear for too long. Doctors checked bruises and her spine for stress. A nurse offered tea in a blanket and the language of practical comfort. Under a quiet fluorescent light, she signed forms that translated fear into the paperwork of aid. Gabriel waited outside the room where she rested. He felt a complexity that had no easy name. He had come here with money, with maps, with legal buffers. But what oxygenated the event was a more stubborn currency, an insistence that someone who had been gentle with his child not be left in a world that only paid in threats. He called Alberto and Clarice and told them the results. They came with the practical things that love sometimes demands: a temporary nanny to fill in, a babysitter to supervise, and a small private ceremony at the apartment to acknowledge the rupture and the rescue. They did not make the event public. Nobody fed the cameras. The rescue was not a spectacle for feeds. It was a return of a person to a life shaken, but not shattered. Later that week, Detective Paulo called with the news of arrests that followed from Helena's statements and Rodrigo's cooperation. 3 men were taken into custody, and the police were putting together charges that would present in court. Rodrigo, who had surrendered several useful leads, faced charges of facilitating debt collection and complicity. He would likely plead to a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony. The process would be slow and mediated by attorneys. Helena, assessed as a coerced participant, was offered immunity from prosecution on the condition she completed a formal statement and agreed to cooperate. "Do you want to press charges?" Paulo asked quietly when he spoke to Gabriel about Helena's role. "It complicates things." Gabriel thought of Davy's laugh, of the lullabies, of the small notes Helena had tucked into seams. He thought of the journal and its confessions, the way despair had braided itself with tenderness. "No," he said after a moment. "She was a victim." "So we treat her as one," Paulo answered. "We'll protect her testimony, and we'll proceed toward those who orchestrated it. But we need her to be ready." She was not ready in the way a courtroom expects readiness. She was ready in the slow, difficult way of a person who had been given a new oxygen. She could choose to speak. She did with a tremor, and then with more steadiness, and the police used what she provided to build a case that would not collapse into a theater of pity. Back in the Ferreira apartment, the immediate logistics required repair. A temporary nanny named Dona Beatriz arrived with a patience that felt like a warm dish. She had worked for households for longer than Gabriel had been alive, and she carried an authority of small, sustaining things. She kept the house steady in the ways adults use to keep a child's clock from spinning into nonsense. Gabriel found himself learning to read Davy's body language, how the baby angled his torso to reach for the spoon or tilted his head toward a particular song. Time after the rescue was not a tidy stitching, it was a series of small acts. Gabriel invited Helena to return for supervised visits. She accepted not with grand promises, but with the careful step of someone trying on a shoe after it had been removed from cold water. The first visit took place under Dona Beatriz's watchful presence, with a social worker there to help manage the crossing of boundaries. The first time Helena sat in the nursery while Davy toddled toward her with a plastic car, her hands trembled. She let him climb into her lap with a reverence that made Gabriel want to watch discreetly, like a man peering through curtains at something sacred. Helena rocked him slowly, humming a lullaby that had once been an ancient habit. She did not try to claim the child in the way a mother might. She simply loved him in measures she could now regulate. Davy's small face looked up and smiled, and Helen's expression broke as if she were seeing light after long confinement. Therapy became an axis of the recovery. Dr. Fernando Campos, a therapist with a direct manner and an empathy that felt earned, met with Helena for weekly sessions that began in a hospital counseling wing and then moved to a community clinic where sessions were quieter and less clinical. They spoke of loss and of the body's hunger for ritual. They spoke of guilt as a muscle that sometimes clenches to prevent something worse, shame as armor. He recommended an integrated treatment plan that included group therapy for bereaved parents, individual psychotherapy for trauma, and a practical plan for financial literacy and reintegration into stable work. Helena took the plan like a map she had not been given before. She began to attend group sessions where other women orbited their own losses and made language out of silence. In the group, she met a woman who had lost a child years earlier and had turned that grief into a vocation of support work. The woman's name was Paula, and she guided Helena toward choices that would not let grief calcify into a private prison. Helena volunteered to help in a perinatal bereavement program at the clinic, an act that seemed both penitent and generative, repair that did not erase the past but made it usable for others. Legal processes, slow and tedious, moved around them. Rodrigo's cooperation led to several names and to the arrests that Detective Paulo's unit made. Court dates were set, hearings were scheduled, prosecutors drafted offers, plea bargains, reductions in exchange for testimony, and a careful parsing of culpability that acknowledged coercion. The city's legal system is never purely moral. It translates human wrongdoing into statutes and asks for proof. The team presented evidence, timestamps, van traces, witness statements, the men's confessions. The ringleader received a sentence that reflected his role, while Rodrigo was scheduled to testify and face a reduced sentence contingent upon his cooperation. Helena was asked to testify in depositions. It was a terrifying ritual. She sat in a small room with a lawyer and repeated events that had burned into her. She did so with pauses and with the counsel of an attorney suggested by social services. Her testimony was coherent. Prosecutors accepted it as credible, and the legal machinery continued to slowly cradle the outcomes into place. It would not be a single decisive verdict that healed everything, but it would establish accountability. Meanwhile, Gabriel began to change in quieter ways. He shifted his office hours. He refused a few meetings he had once assumed he deserved. He asked a partner to take over a project that required his attention. He started attending pediatric checkups and memorizing the pattern of Davy's laughter. He began to read aloud each night without speed, letting the rhythm of words be a small ritual that both man and baby shared. There were moments of awkwardness and learning. Gabriel discovered that warming a bottle correctly was an act of science and art. He learned to braid Davy's hair, well, to watch someone else do it and then attempt. His grief for Mariana did not vanish. Instead, it took on a new habit, a companionate sorrow that sometimes sat by him during bedtime songs, and sometimes rose up when he walked past his wife's chair. He found that presence could be enough. Being there mattered more than trying to fix the unfixable. Helena's rehabilitation was not linear. Some mornings she rose with a heavy, leaden weight. Other days she walked as if the sun had been a souvenir she could carry in her pocket. Dr. Fernando guided her through cognitive exercises for intrusive thoughts and taught her grounding techniques for panic. Institutional supports helped with signing up for a program that provided childcare training and a small stipend for job placement. For someone who had been hurt and held small, having the scaffolding of a legitimate job and the skill set to work in childcare felt like a reclaiming of agency. 6 months later, the rhythm of the Ferreira apartment looked different. The house had been filled with subtle changes. A small shelf of children's books stacked neatly by height, a hand-painted piggy bank with Davy's name scribbled on it, a calendar where Gabriel marked pediatric appointments, therapy sessions, and a family outing now and then. Helena had a schedule that made her more predictable and less precarious. 2 mornings a week she would come to the house as a paid caregiver with a social worker's oversight. Twice a month she would attend group therapy. She worked afternoons at a community center teaching baby massage to new mothers. The word reliable, a simple adjective, became the softest of coronations for someone who had been torn by debt and fear. On a spring day, Clarice stood in the doorway to the nursery holding a small cake and an improvised banner made of colored paper. They celebrated Davy's 2nd birthday with soft balloons and a handful of friends. It was not a large affair. Gabriel disliked spectacle, but it felt full in ways that mattered. Helena sat beside him at the table, and Gabriel watched her laugh in a way that made him register the sound in a new register. It had survived. The party was small and guarded, but it held a sense of ceremony that acknowledged survival without turning it into spectacle. Helena slept more steadily now, and when she awoke, the first thing she did was feed Davy a breakfast. She prepared herself, as if making porridge had a moral weight she could carry. She and Gabriel had begun to codify their boundaries into a document, clear hours, responsibilities, and a plan for therapy. They called it, somewhat humorously, the Boundaries Pact. It was not a contract of legalistic bitterness, but a paper proof that they would not let old patterns rule their present. Gabriel insisted on privacy clauses, no sudden disappearances, no secrets about money. Helena agreed to maintain regular therapy and to notify social services when she felt unstable. Rodrigo's case moved through the courts. He testified against the men who had acted as enforcers. The prosecutors built a case that relied less on melodrama and more on detailed proof. The men who had run the extortion ring received sentences that reflected their roles. Rodrigo's penalty was reduced because of his cooperation and because he had provided names that led to the ringleader's conviction. It was not a neat moral accounting, few legal outcomes ever are, but it satisfied what the system could deliver given the evidence. Throughout this period, the press did not find an opening to make the story a spectacle. Gabriel had been careful. Clarice had kept chatter minimal. A few local outlets ran short pieces about a business person who had worked with police to help a kidnapped nanny, but the coverage was sparse and lacked the maw of sensationalism. In smaller ways, the city absorbed the event as one of many human stories that moved quietly through its arteries. The therapy work deepened for Helen. She began to keep a separate journal, a practice that Dr. Fernando suggested as a tether. It was not the frantic diary that had recorded the terror of debt, but a careful list of small thankfuls and tasks. She allowed herself to write down a request for help when she needed it. Helena. Journal entry. September 1st. I can sit in a park and not feel my chest pull like a fist. Today a woman smiled at me with the memory of something lost, and I did not have to look away. It was a small grace. I still carry him like a stone, but the stone no longer stops me from walking. Months passed, and the threads of habit wove into a fabric that was more resistant to tearing. Gabriel, who had once thought of fatherhood in terms of provision, learned that presence recalibrated everything else. He found himself reading more slowly, listening with the spare patience of someone who wanted to learn the contours of a small person's mind, rather than simply fill it. He enrolled in a parenting workshop. He described it to friends as research, but inside it felt like repentance and apprenticeship. Helena found work that did not put her at risk. She obtained a certificate in early childhood care that Dr. Fernando subsidized through a program for vulnerable adults. She worked part-time at a community center, leading a grief support playgroup for parents who had lost infants. The work seemed to focus her energy outward and made the world less about private debt and more about mutual aid. A year after the van at the port, Gabriel organized a small acknowledgement in the nursery. It was not a formal ceremony, but a way of saying aloud, "We will be honest now." He invited Clarice, Alberto, Dona Beatriz, and Dr. Fernando. There was a cake and a small speech, short, unornamented, about being present. Gabriel did not try to narrate forgiveness as an absolution. He said only that trust could be rebuilt in time and with honesty. Helena listened, tears measured, and then aloud. In court, Rodrigo received his sentence, the result of a plea and cooperation. It was not as severe as the men who had worked the port, but it was enough to keep him under supervision and to give prosecutors a public accounting. The rulings did not erase what had happened, but acknowledged responsibility. The men who had been arrested for the kidnapping were prosecuted. The law did something imperfect but meaningful. It placed lines where violence had once blurred them. 3 years later, the image of the family that had been almost fractured by grief began to look like a composite of mended things. Davy was no longer the toddler leaning into laps. He ran with the freedom that small children claim as their natural right. He wore a cap with a dinosaur on Sundays and held 2 hands, Gabriel's and sometimes Helena's, when they crossed busy streets. Helena had kept to her therapy and had become a volunteer coordinator at the bereavement center she once visited, helping other parents navigate the narrow corridors grief demands. She had found, in sharing her story, a vocation that turned private injury into communal aid. Her journal, once a map of dangerous edges, had become a ledger of small repairs. On a bright autumn afternoon, Gabriel took Davy to a park where children chased pigeons and the maple trees burned red and gold. They met Helena by the play structure. Clarice sat on a bench nearby with a thermos and a book, and Donna Beatriz pushed a stroller, as if age had only made her more patient. The scene was ordinary in the best sense. It had no grand proclamations, only the soft authority of lives that had been pushed toward each other and decided not to fall into the trap of mutual possession. Gabriel watched Helena lift Davy onto the slide. Her hand steadied him in that small parental choreography she had learned and taught. After the child slid down, he looked up, grinning, and ran to Gabriel, who scooped him and twirled him until his laughter rose like bells. Helena sat on the bench and watched with a small, careful smile. Gabriel caught her eye, and in the catching of it, there was a shared acknowledgment. They had gone through things that could have been stories of ruin. Instead, they had built something quieter, a family made by intention, not by accident. Helena was not a replacement for what had been lost. She was a companion in the reconstruction, a human being whose past had shaped her but not defined her final shape. As they walked home that day, Gabriel took a small detour through a community garden. He stopped and planted a sapling. A small tree, they agreed, would be Davy's tree. It was not a dramatic gesture, no plaque, no ceremony, but it was a deliberate act of rooting. He dug, placed the sapling carefully into the soil, covered its roots with hands that remembered the weight of repair. Helena stood nearby, her fingers still dusted from tending to a small bag of seeds she had bought earlier for the community center. "This will be ours to watch grow," Gabriel said, and he felt the sentence as if it were a vow, simple and slow. Davy clapped his hands and kicked at the loosened earth. He had a smudge on his cheek that made his face look like a painted cherub. Helena laughed, and Gabriel smiled in a way that felt like the end of a long, fractious sentence. The letter that had come to him in the morning, folded, crumpled, and full of instructions, had done what letters do best. It made a decision outwardly visible. It forced him to look, to act, to hold the messy consequences of mercy. When he thought back to that frantic morning when the apartment seemed too big for only two, he no longer felt the long, hollow loneliness of a man sitting with open grief. He felt instead the quiet labor of a life being rebuilt with hands that both gave and received. Helena, who once wrote in a tiny, slanting script about being more dangerous than time had prepared her to be, now made lists of cooking recipes for Clarice, dates for the therapy group, and a small set of books she wanted Davy to read when he was older. She kept her old journal, but the entries shifted. They were not clean. They were honest. Helena, journal entry, November 10th. I still carry Miguel in the fold of everything I do. Sometimes it is a shape I can touch. Sometimes it is the scent of a blanket. But I can say his name without it splintering me. Today I played a lullaby for a mother who cried through almost all of it, and afterward she told me her chest felt lighter. That felt like being forgiven, not by law but by a life given back. The public did not see this slow work in detail. They saw at most a headline that faded. The more important audience was smaller, the children, the few adults who had chosen to stay through awkwardness, and the quiet rows of social workers and therapists who measured success in days, not headlines. Gabriel still missed Mariana. He planted small rituals that remembered her, a book propped open at the page she had once loved, a Saturday morning walk they had kept before the diagnosis. But the ritual of grief had widened to include acts that were generous and messy, coaxing Davy to eat his vegetables, sitting with Helena during a group when she needed quiet, and reworking his calendar so he could be at home when Davy needed him. In the end, the story that had started with a crumpled note and a baby's hand offered a softer truth. People are both fragile and resilient, and rescue is rarely clean. It asks for mediation, for legal action, and perhaps most importantly, for the willingness to let those who have been hurt into a life that is bounded by accountability and kindness. On a quiet evening, years after the letter first slid into his hands, Gabriel sat in the nursery and found the folded paper again. He did not open it to reread the handwriting. Instead, he placed it into a drawer next to the small leather journal that Helena had once kept. He closed the drawer and listened to Davy's breath. The house no longer felt like an echo chamber of loss. It carried the sounds of ordinary life and the small, recurring wonder of a child growing up. If this story touched you, if you believe in second chances or the hard work it takes to rebuild, please like and subscribe. Share in the comments. What would you do in Gabriel's place? Would you have paid, called the police, or tried to handle it yourself?